Elias Kane stepped cautiously through the alien corridor, his boots pressing into the smooth, glass-like surface beneath him. The walls pulsed faintly, soft hues of blue and violet rippling like quiet waves, as though the structure itself were breathing. He paused, gripping the worn strap of his gear pack, listening to the faint hum vibrating through the air. It wasn't silence. It was something softer, a sound that felt like a whisper, calling him deeper. His breaths were steady, controlled, but each step made his pulse quicken. The air was warm, carrying a scent that was sweet and unfamiliar, like blooming flowers touched by rain. Light danced along the walls, reflecting his shadow in fragments. Elias pressed forward, drawn by the rhythm of the glow, feeling it match the beat of his own heart. He didn't know how long he had been wandering this place. Hours, days. It was hard to tell anymore. The alien structure seemed endless, a labyrinth built by hands that no longer existed. And yet, it didn't feel abandoned. It felt alive, watching, waiting. Then he saw it. A doorway, half sealed by what looked like living tendrils of glass, shifted at his approach. They peeled apart, fluid and deliberate, revealing a chamber bathed in silver light. Elias stepped inside. The room was circular, its walls carved with intricate patterns that pulsed like veins beneath translucent skin. At the center, encased in what looked like a crystalline cocoon, was a figure. His breath hitched. The figure was feminine. Her body seemed sculpted from the light itself, smooth and lithe, with skin that shimmered faintly like moonlight on water. Patterns of soft blue and gold traced her arms and collarbone, glowing gently as though responding to his presence. Her eyes were closed, and her face carried an expression of serene longing, as if she had been waiting, dreaming, for someone to find her. Elias took another step closer. The cocoon responded, thin strands of light retracting and peeling away like petals opening in slow motion. The glow intensified, and for the first time, her chest rose in a breath, slow and shallow at first, then deeper. Elias swallowed, his throat dry, unable to tear his eyes away as her lids fluttered open. Her gaze met his, and the air between them shifted. Her eyes weren't human, larger, more luminous, shifting colors that rippled with her breath. He couldn't tell if it was fear or hope reflecting in them. Maybe both. She tried to stand, her legs trembling slightly as she steadied herself. Elias instinctively stepped forward, ready to catch her if she fell, but her voice stopped him. "I cannot be alone any longer." The words struck him, not just the sound of them, but the way they carried a weight that lingered in the air. Her voice was soft, melodic, yet laced with something raw. Loneliness. It hit him harder than he expected. Elias took another step, slowly lowering his weapon, not out of trust, but because it felt wrong to keep holding it. Her eyes followed the movement, and her expression softened, as though his gesture meant more than words ever could. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment she hesitated, as though speaking the name out loud might break her. "Kalara," she said at last. He repeated it under his breath, letting it settle between them. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent against the smooth floor. "Why are you here?" Elias asked, his voice gentler now. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I am the last." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Elias felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't need her to explain it. The patterns glowing softly across her skin, the stillness of this place, the way her eyes held so much sadness, it told him everything. And yet there was something else, something unspoken. Kalara raised her head, her eyes searching his face, and for the first time, Elias noticed the trembling of her hands. "You don't understand," she said, stepping closer. Her voice shook, not from fear, but from desperation. "I cannot survive like this. My body cannot." She paused, and he saw the faintest shimmer of tears in her eyes. "I need to bond." The words weren't loud, but they struck Elias like a thunderclap. His mind raced to catch up, but the look in her eyes, the raw pleading, left no room for misunderstanding. She stepped closer, her body so near that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Please," she whispered. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't know what it meant, or what it would cost him. All he knew was that he couldn't look away, and neither could she. Elias stood frozen in the shimmering light, Kalara's words lingering in the air between them. "I need to bond." Her voice was soft, yet it carried a weight that pressed against his chest, leaving him breathless. He wanted to speak, to ask her what she meant, but the look in her eyes silenced him. There was no malice there, no hidden motives, only raw desperation, laid bare and trembling. Kalara took another step closer, her bare feet moving with grace, and Elias felt the space between them shrink until he could almost feel the warmth radiating from her skin. It wasn't like any warmth he'd felt before. It was gentle, soothing, yet somehow alive, as though it reached out and caressed his senses. "I don't understand," Elias managed, his voice quieter than he intended. Kalara's gaze flickered, the colors in her eyes shifting, soft gold melting into blue. She seemed to struggle with the words, her breath hitching as she tried to explain. "My kind," she began, her voice trembling. "We were created to be connected, to feel each other, our thoughts, our desires, our needs. Without that bond," she paused, wrapping her arms around herself as though to hold something fragile inside her. "Without it, we fade." She looked at him then, and Elias felt something in his chest tighten. "Fade," he repeated, her head tilted, her glowing patterns dimming slightly. "We are not meant to be alone. Our bodies, they are incomplete without connection. The bond sustains us." Elias swallowed hard. He wanted to ask more questions, to press for answers, but her voice broke through his thoughts again. "I've been awake for less than an hour," she said softly, "and already I feel it." He blinked. "Feel what?" "The ache." The words hung between them, and Elias suddenly noticed the way her hands trembled. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin seemed to shimmer more brightly, as though struggling to hold its form. He took a step back, instinctively needing space, but Kalara followed, her movements fluid but urgent. "Please," she said, her voice catching as she reached for him. She stopped short, her fingers hovering just above his arm, afraid to touch, but unable to pull away. "I can't do this alone." Elias stared at her hand, then at her face. Her beauty was undeniable, alien, yes, but in a way that seemed crafted by some higher art. The glowing lines along her skin pulsed faintly, and he could almost feel the heat emanating from them. His heartbeat quickened. "I don't even know what you're asking of me," he said, though his voice was softer now. Kalara exhaled, lowering her hand, but the gesture didn't mask her trembling. "I need more than survival," she said. "I need to feel connected, not just touched, but seen, held." Her voice faltered, and she looked away as if ashamed. "I need to feel wanted." Elias felt his breath catch again. He couldn't explain why her words hit him so deeply, but they did. Before he could respond, Kalara stepped closer, and this time, her fingers brushed against his forearm. A ripple. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was heat, gentle but undeniable, spreading from the point of contact like an ember awakening beneath his skin. Elias stiffened, his pulse pounding as Kalara gasped quietly, her eyes widening. "You feel it," she whispered. He didn't answer, but the look in her eyes told him she already knew. Her touch lingered, and Elias felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just her warmth. It was something deeper, more intimate, as though the energy from her skin was reaching into him, stirring parts of himself he had long forgotten. He pulled back, breaking the contact, but the sensation lingered. Kalara let out a quiet breath, her hands falling to her sides. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean." "It's not that," Elias interrupted, his voice unsteady. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to think, but the echo of her touch still lingered, making it hard to focus. "This bond, what does it mean?" he asked. Kalara hesitated, her eyes searching his as though trying to measure his readiness. "It's more than physical," she said softly. "It's emerging. A connection deeper than words. Your thoughts, your feelings, shared with mine. It binds us." Her voice lowered, and the next words came out almost as a whisper. "It completes us." Elias stared at her, his chest tightening. Everything about this was too much, too sudden, too intimate. But the way she looked at him, the way her voice trembled, made it impossible for him to turn away. He stepped closer without thinking, drawn to the sadness in her eyes. "And if you don't bond?" Kalara swallowed hard. "I won't survive." Her words hung heavy, and Elias felt the weight of them settle inside him. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension thickened, and Elias's gaze dropped to her lips before he pulled it away again, ashamed at how easily desire threatened to overtake reason. Kalara seemed to sense it, the hesitation, the conflict, and her expression softened. "I'm not asking this of you lightly," she said, "but I can feel it already, the bond forming between us. And I think you can feel it too." Elias opened his mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. He could still feel the warmth of her touch, the way her voice had wrapped around him and settled beneath his skin. He took another breath, steadying himself. "Tell me what I need to do." Kalara exhaled slowly, relief mixing with longing in her eyes as she reached for him again. This time, Elias didn't pull away. Elias stood still, his breath unsteady as Kalara's fingers hovered just above his skin. The glow emanating from her markings pulsed gently, as though her body responded to the nearness of his own. Her eyes, shimmering with liquid hues of blue and gold, searched his face as though looking for permission, for trust. "Let me show you," she whispered, her voice low and steady, though Elias caught the faintest tremor beneath it. He didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. That seemed to be enough for her. Kalara's fingertips brushed against the inside of his wrist, featherlight, and Elias inhaled sharply. The contact sent a wave of warmth up his arm, gentle but undeniably intimate, like the first flicker of fire in a darkened room. Her touch lingered, and where her skin met his, faint lines of light spread outward, trailing along his veins. "This is how we begin," she said softly. Her patterns flared, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Or maybe it was her heartbeat. Elias couldn't tell anymore. The glow moved in ripples, alive and responding to his breath, his pulse. "It's beautiful," he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Kalara smiled, but there was sadness in it too. "It's more than beauty," she said. "It's a language." Elias swallowed, trying to steady himself as her fingers traced a line up his forearm. The light followed her movements, curling like threads of gold and silver. "We don't speak with words alone," she continued. "Touch, it carries meaning. It binds us to one another. It tells us who we are, what we feel." Her touch grew firmer, and Elias shivered, but not from cold. He could feel something stirring beneath his skin, as though her energy were reaching into him, inviting him to respond. "I feel it," he admitted quietly. Kalara looked up at him, her expression softening. "Then let yourself feel it," she said. "Don't hold back." Elias hesitated. He had spent so much of his life guarding himself, keeping emotions locked away. But here, with her so close, it felt impossible to keep the barriers in place. He let out a slow breath and let his fingers rise, touching her wrist in return. The reaction was immediate. Kalara gasped softly, her markings flaring brighter, spreading in intricate patterns along her neck and collarbone. Elias felt the warmth intensify, sinking into his chest, his stomach deeper. She closed her eyes, and her breath hitched. "You're learning," she whispered, her voice trembling now. "You're reaching for me. That's what I need." Her words stirred something in him, something protective, something raw. He let his hand move higher, brushing her shoulder, and the patterns on her skin pulsed again, faster this time. Her breathing quickened, and Elias felt his own match hers. "Kalara," he said softly. She opened her eyes, and the depth of longing in them stopped him. She wasn't just asking for a connection. She was pleading for it. For something deeper, something that would anchor her to the world and pull her back from the edge of fading. "I've been alone for so long," she said. "Even before I slept, I felt it. The ache. The emptiness. I thought it would break me." Her voice cracked, and Elias felt the words settle heavily inside him. "You're not alone now," he said, and the promise carried more weight than he intended. Kalara's hand rose to his face, her fingers brushing his jaw, and Elias leaned into her touch without thinking. It was as though his body no longer waited for permission. It responded instinctively, drawn to her. "Don't let me disappear," she whispered. "You won't," he said, and the words felt final. She stepped closer, her body so near that he could feel her heat even without touching. The patterns of light along her skin moved in rhythm with her breath, and Elias found himself reaching again, this time without hesitation. His hand cupped the side of her neck, and her markings flared brighter, spreading outward like living veins of light. Her lips parted, and for a moment Elias thought she might speak again, but she didn't. Instead, she leaned in, closing the space between them until he could feel the faint brush of her breath against his lips. The tension between them thickened, and Elias felt his pulse racing, heat pooling low in his stomach. But Kalara stopped just short, her eyes locked on his. "Not yet," she whispered. "We have to do this slowly." Elias exhaled sharply, and Kalara smiled, as though sensing the need rising in him. She stepped back, her fingertips lingering on his chest before pulling away completely. "Touch is only the first layer," she said, her voice steadying again. "There's more, deeper connections. But you have to trust me." Elias nodded, though the ache her absence left behind made him want to pull her close again. "I trust you," he said. Kalara's markings pulsed once more, and Elias felt the warmth return, not through her touch this time, but through the bond forming between them. It was faint, a thread of connection that hummed just beneath the surface, but it was there, and it was growing. Elias sat at the edge of the glowing chamber, his hands braced against the smooth, glass-like surface beneath him. The light around them dimmed and pulsed in time with Kalara's breath, a rhythm so steady that he could feel it syncing with his own. But inside, his thoughts raced. He could still feel the heat of her touch on his skin, lingering long after she had stepped away. It wasn't just physical. It was deeper. Something he couldn't name, something that made his chest tighten every time she looked at him. Kalara knelt a few feet away, her glowing pattern subdued now, as though the energy between them had settled into a fragile calm. Her hands rested lightly on her knees, her shoulders drawn inward. She hadn't spoken since their last exchange. Neither had he. But the silence wasn't empty. Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair before finally breaking the stillness. "This bond," he said quietly, "what does it actually mean for me?" Kalara turned, her eyes meeting his. She studied him for a moment, the colors in her irises shifting faintly. "It changes you," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "Not who you are, but how you feel." Her gaze dropped for a moment, and Elias saw the faintest tremble in her hands before she folded them in her lap. "You'll feel what I feel," she continued. "Not just thoughts, but emotions. Desire, fear, longing. And I'll feel yours." She hesitated, then looked up again. "It's not something that can be undone." Elias let her words settle, but the weight of them pressed harder than he wanted to admit. "Then what happens to me?" he asked. Kalara's expression faltered, and for the first time, Elias saw the fear she had been hiding. "You won't stop being human," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "But you'll become more connected, vulnerable." Her voice wavered. "And I know that scares you." Elias tensed, but she didn't look away this time. "It scares me too," she whispered. Her honesty disarmed him. Kalara took a shaky breath and stood, stepping closer. Her markings flared slightly, as if responding to the movement. "I've felt alone for so long," she said, her voice quieter now. "Even before my people were gone, I felt it. That ache. The one that reminds you how empty you are when no one sees you. Really sees you." Her words pierced through him. Elias wanted to look away, to retreat into the walls he'd built long ago, but he couldn't. Not when her voice trembled like that. Not when her hands clenched at her sides, as though holding herself together took effort. "I don't just need this bond to survive," Kalara admitted. "I need it because I can't bear to feel that emptiness anymore. And I'm afraid," she paused, her breath catching. "I'm afraid that if you let me feel something, if you give me hope, you'll take it away again." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Elias pushed himself to his feet, closing the distance between them before he realized what he was doing. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said firmly, but his voice softened as he added, "I couldn't." Kalara's gaze lifted to his, and for the first time, Elias saw tears glimmering at the corners of her eyes. "You say that now," she whispered. The word stung, but Elias didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, hesitating only briefly before cupping her face in his hands. Her skin was warm beneath his touch, and the glow along her markings responded immediately, flaring with gentle light. Kalara closed her eyes, leaning into him as though the weight of her body could no longer hold itself upright. Elias felt his own breath quicken as the warmth between them deepened, seeping into him. He could feel her trembling. "Look at me," he said softly. Her eyes opened, wide and vulnerable. "You're not alone anymore," he said. Kalara's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she reached up, her fingers brushing his jaw, tracing the line of it before settling against his cheek. And then she leaned in. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, unsure, but the moment their lips touched, the bond flared. Light surged through Kalara's markings, spreading outward and reflecting off the crystalline walls, bathing the chamber in a golden glow. Elias gasped against her mouth, his heart pounding as heat coursed through him, filling every inch of his body. He could feel her, really feel her. Her fear, her longing, her hope. It wrapped around him, pulling him in deeper. Kalara moaned softly, and the sound sent a shiver down his spine. Her arms slid around his neck, pulling him closer as their kiss deepened. Elias let himself fall into it, his hands sliding down to her waist, holding her as though she might slip away if he let go. The glow from her markings pulsed faster now, matching the rhythm of their breaths. Elias could feel the bond tightening, growing stronger with each passing second, until it felt as though their bodies no longer ended where the other began. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. Kalara's eyes shone with tears, but there was no sadness in them now, only awe. "It's starting," she whispered, her voice trembling. Elias swallowed, still holding her close. "I know," he said, and this time he didn't pull away. Elias held Kalara close, her breath warm against his chest as the light from her markings pulsed in steady waves, washing over them both. The glow seemed alive, its rhythm matching the slow rise and fall of her breathing, as if her body was speaking in a language only he could feel now. His fingers brushed against the small of her back, and she shivered under his touch. The reaction sent a surge of heat through him, the bond between them deepening with every shared breath, every gentle press of skin against skin. Kalara tilted her head, her glowing eyes fixed on him. There was no fear in them now, only trust and something deeper, something Elias didn't have words for. She reached up, her fingertips tracing the edge of his jaw, following the contours of his face, as though memorizing him. "This is how it begins," she whispered. Elias's pulse quickened as her fingers trailed down to his neck, her touch leaving a faint warmth in its wake. Her markings responded, glowing brighter with each movement, the light expanding outward until it wrapped around them, both like a cocoon. He closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the sensation. It wasn't just her touch he felt anymore. It was her. The ache she carried, the longing, the desperate hope that she could be saved from the emptiness that had consumed her people. It overwhelmed him, and for a moment he struggled against it, against the weight of her emotions pressing into him. But then Kalara's voice cut through the haze, soft and steady. "Don't fight it," she said. Her hands moved to his chest, resting just above his heart. Elias opened his eyes and saw the tears shimmering in hers. "Let me in," she whispered, and he did. The change was gradual at first, a warmth spreading outward from where her palms rested against his skin. It felt like sunlight breaking through after a long, cold night. But as the bond deepened, the warmth grew, turning into something more, a pulse, a current of energy that moved between them, threading through his veins and anchoring him to her. Elias inhaled sharply, his body reacting to the surge. It wasn't painful, but it was intense, each wave of heat carrying something new, something that wasn't entirely his. Kalara let out a soft cry, her body trembling as the light along her markings flared. She pressed closer, her arms wrapping around him as though she could steady herself against the storm building inside them both. Elias held her tighter, his fingers tracing the patterns of light on her back. The glow pulsed faster, matching the rhythm of their hearts, until it felt like they were no longer two separate beings, but part of the same current, the same energy. Kalara's breath hitched as her body responded to his touch, her markings spreading further, glowing brighter. She pressed her forehead against his, and for the first time, Elias felt it, her thoughts, her emotions, her love pouring into him as though the walls between them had vanished. She wasn't just showing him who she was giving him pieces of herself, fragments of memories and feelings that swirled inside him. He saw her world before it fell, the laughter of her people, the beauty of their rituals, the joy of connection. And then he felt the loss, the emptiness, the desperation that had driven her to cling to hope even as everything around her crumbled. Elias's breath caught, and he pulled her closer. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered, the words barely audible. But Kalara's body shuddered against his, as if she'd heard them more clearly than anything else. She tilted her head, and their lips met again, this time deeper, more certain. The kiss ignited something between them, the bond flaring as heat spread outward, wrapping them both in its glow. Kalara moaned softly, her hands sliding down his back, her touch both gentle and urgent. Elias responded without hesitation, his fingers tracing the lines of her markings, feeling the energy beneath her skin as though it were alive. The glow deepened, and Elias felt his own body respond, his skin warming, his pulse quickening as the bond took hold. It wasn't just physical. It was emotional, raw, and unyielding, a merging of everything they were. Kalara pulled back slightly, her eyes wide as she looked at him. "It's happening," she said softly. Elias nodded, his voice rough. "I can feel it." And he could. The energy flowing between them shifted, sinking deeper, wrapping around his thoughts, his senses, until he wasn't sure where he ended and she began. Kalara's hands pressed against his chest, and Elias gasped as a surge of heat rolled through him, his skin tingling as if it were alive with the same energy that pulsed within her. Her markings flared, and Elias saw faint patterns beginning to form on his own skin, lines of light that mirrored hers, binding them together in ways he couldn't fully understand. "You're changing," she whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Elias looked down, his breath catching as the patterns glowed faintly beneath his skin. "I don't feel different," he said, but Kalara shook her head. "You're not losing yourself," she said. "You're becoming more." Her words calmed him, and Elias reached for her again, pulling her into his arms as the light slowly began to fade, leaving only the soft hum of energy between them. Kalara's body sagged against his, her breath uneven, but when she looked up at him, there was no fear, only relief. Tears slipped down her cheeks, and Elias brushed them away with his thumb, his voice soft. "It's over," he said. Kalara shook her head. "No," she whispered. "It's only just beginning." She leaned into him then, burying her face against his neck, and Elias held her, letting the bond settle between them like a quiet flame. And for the first time since he'd stepped into this place, he didn't feel lost anymore. Neither did she. Elias lay back, his fingers tracing the faint lines of light that still lingered on his skin, their patterns fading in and out as though breathing with him. The glow wasn't as intense now, but it hadn't disappeared. It was part of him, part of them, alive, steady, constant. Kalara rested beside him, her head nestled against his shoulder. Her breathing was soft, even, but every so often he could feel the slight tremble in her body, as if the bond between them was still settling. Her markings pulsed faintly, reflecting her calm and the warmth of their closeness. For the first time since meeting her, Elias felt a sense of stillness, not the emptiness he had carried for so long, but a fullness, as though something that had been missing had quietly clicked into place. He turned his head slightly, pressing a kiss to the crown of her hair, and Kalara responded with a contented sigh. "You're quiet," she whispered, her voice soft, edged with drowsiness but steady. Elias smiled, his fingers continuing their slow exploration of the light patterns along her arm. "I'm just feeling it," he said. "All of it." Kalara shifted, tilting her head to look up at him. Her eyes, still glowing faintly, searched his face. "And how does it feel?" Elias didn't answer right away. Instead, he cupped her cheek, letting his thumb trace the curve of her jaw as he searched for the words. "Like I can finally breathe," he said. Kalara's lips parted, and for a moment, Elias thought she might cry again, but instead, she smiled, a soft, radiant smile that sent warmth blooming through his chest. "I feel it too," she said. Her voice carried the weight of truth, and Elias knew she wasn't just saying it. He could feel it, her relief, her wonder, her hope, woven through the bond that pulsed gently between them. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced, and yet already felt as natural as breathing. Kalara shifted closer, her fingers sliding over his chest, tracing the faint glow still lingering beneath his skin. "I can feel you," she whispered. "Even when I close my eyes, you're here." Elias caught her hand, pressing it against his chest. "And I can feel you," he said. Her markings flared briefly at his words, and she leaned up, brushing her lips against his in a kiss that was soft, unhurried, less about urgency and more about savoring the connection they had built. When they parted, Kalara rested her forehead against his. "I thought I'd lost this forever," she said quietly. Elias wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer. "You didn't," he said. "You never will." The promise hung between them, steady and unshaken. They stayed like that for a long time, the glow from their bond bathing the room in a soft warmth that seemed to hum with life. Kalara's fingers moved absently over his skin, tracing the lines and patterns, and Elias let himself sink into the sensation, the heat, the softness, the quiet rhythm that bound them together. "You're part of me now," she said softly. Elias nodded. "And you're part of me." Kalara smiled again, this time with more certainty, and Elias felt her emotions through the bond, hope, affection, longing, all wrapped together and flowing into him. "Tell me something," Elias said after a moment. Kalara tilted her head. "What?" "Your people," he began carefully. Do you think they could still be out there?" Kalara's smile faltered slightly, and her expression turned thoughtful. "I don't know," she admitted. "I felt so sure I was the last. But now," she closed her eyes briefly, as if searching for something beyond the walls of the chamber. "Now I feel echoes. Faint, but real." Elias's brows furrowed. "Echoes." Kalara opened her eyes and nodded. "Not voices, not thoughts, but something. A hum, like distant energy. I thought it was my imagination at first, but now that the bond is stabilized," she paused, searching his face. "I think there might be others." The words sent a ripple of energy through Elias, and Kalara must have felt it too, because her markings flared slightly. "If there are others," Elias said slowly, "we'll find them." Kalara's eyes softened, and she leaned into him again, resting her head against his chest. "You mean that?" she said. "I do," Elias replied without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Kalara let out a soft breath, and Elias felt the tension in her body ease completely for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other, the faint hum of the alien structure around them blending with the gentle rhythm of their breathing. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kalara no longer felt like she was standing on the edge of extinction. And for the first time, Elias no longer felt like he was drifting through life without purpose. They had found each other, two souls who had been lost, now bound together, stronger than either had been alone. As Kalara's markings dimmed, signaling rest, Elias held her close, pressing one more kiss to her temple. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. And as the bond pulsed softly between them, Elias knew, deep in his bones, that this was only the beginning. The chamber was quieter now. The soft hum of energy that had surrounded them earlier had faded into the background, leaving only the steady rhythm of their breaths and the faint glow of Kalara's markings as a reminder of what had passed between them. Elias sat with his back against the curved wall, Kalara curled into his side. Her head rested lightly against his chest, her fingertips tracing absent patterns along his forearm, as if the act of touching him helped anchor her to this moment. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Through the bond, Elias could feel her emotions, warm and steady now. The fear that had clung to her when they first met was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of security. It made him tighten his arm around her, pulling her just a little closer. Kalara let out a soft hum of contentment, nuzzling into him, and Elias couldn't help but smile. But just as he began to close his eyes, something shifted. It wasn't loud, not a sound or a vibration, but Elias felt it all the same. It was a ripple, faint and distant, brushing against the edges of the bond like the whisper of a breeze through leaves. Kalara stiffened against him. Elias's eyes snapped open, and he looked down to find her markings glowing brighter, a pulse of light that didn't match the calm they'd shared just seconds earlier. "Kalara." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze was distant, her lips slightly parted, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. "Kalara," Elias said again, more firmly this time, and her eyes refocused, locking onto his. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias frowned, sitting up straighter. "Feel what?" Kalara reached for his hand, pressing it against the markings on her wrist. The glow beneath his fingers pulsed, and for a moment, Elias thought it was just their bond, just the echo of what had already passed between them. But then he felt it. It wasn't Kalara. It wasn't him. It was something else. Faint, distant, like the echo of a heartbeat carried across an endless stretch of water. Elias's pulse quickened. "What is that?" Kalara shook her head, her eyes wide. "I don't know," she said, but her voice trembled, and Elias could feel the flicker of hope pushing through her fear. "Is it?" He hesitated, afraid to even say the words out loud. "Is it one of your people?" Kalara swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around his. "I don't know," she said again, but this time her voice cracked. Elias shifted, cupping her face with one hand. "What do you feel?" Kalara closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath as she focused. Her markings pulsed again, brighter now, responding to whatever it was that brushed against her senses. "It's faint," she said. "So faint I almost missed it. But it's there." She opened her eyes, and the look she gave him made Elias's chest tighten. "It's not just a signal," she said. "It's alive." Elias didn't speak. He didn't have to. He could feel the weight of those words, the meaning behind them, through the bond they shared. Alive. Kalara pulled back slightly, her hands trembling now as she touched the patterns of light on his arm. "I thought I was the last," she whispered. "I thought there was nothing left but me." Elias caught her hands, steadying them. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We'll find out what this is. Who this is. Together." Kalara's markings brightened, responding not just to her emotions, but to his. The bond between them flared, steady and unyielding, and Elias felt the warmth of it spread through his chest. "You mean it?" she asked. "I do," Elias said without hesitation. "Whatever this is, we'll face it together." Kalara's lips trembled, but this time, it wasn't fear Elias felt through the bond. It was hope, fragile, but growing. She leaned into him again, resting her forehead against his. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias let his hands slide down to her waist, holding her close as the glow from her markings bathed them both in light. But even as he comforted her, he couldn't ignore the sensation still brushing against the edges of the bond, the faint signal, growing stronger now, calling out to them from somewhere beyond the walls of this place. Kalara shifted in his arms, her voice barely audible. "We'll have to leave here," she said. Elias nodded. "Then we leave." Kalara's markings pulsed brighter again, and for the first time since waking, she smiled without hesitation. "We'll find them," she said, her voice stronger now. "And if there's even a chance they survived." Elias didn't let her finish. He pressed his lips against hers, silencing the words, but sealing the promise. When they finally pulled apart, Kalara's eyes gleamed, not with tears this time, but with determination. Elias reached for his pack, pulling it over his shoulder as Kalara stepped beside him. The bond between them hummed, steady and alive, as they took their first steps out of the chamber, together. The signal was still faint, but it was out there waiting. And so was their future.